Today we want to be thinking about the next beatitude that is given as Jesus began the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're thinking about Matthew chapter 5 verse 6, where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. What is it to hunger and to thirst for righteousness? What is righteousness? Who gets to say what is right and what is wrong? Well, that is God. Jesus will later go on to say in his Sermon on the Mount that we're to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, God's righteousness. And we are to hunger and to thirst for God, for his righteousness, for his goodness, to come to God, to understand what is right and wrong, to understand what is good and evil, and what does God say about these things, and then have a hunger and a thirst in ourselves to live in God's righteousness, to be right with God, and to live in his righteousness. And God reveals all of that to us in his word. But really an important part there is the being hungry and thirsty for it. Is it something that we're truly concerned about, interested in, longing for, seeking, desiring, or do we really have that hunger and that thirst for God? Because if we do, we will be filled through his word, his spirit, but we've got to hunger. We've got to thirst. We've got to want it. We've got to seek God and his kingdom and his righteousness. We've got to desire that God is more than ready and willing and happy to fill us with his word, for us to continue to learn and grow closer to him, to grow more in his righteousness. But we've got to want it. God's not going to force it down our throat. God's not going to force us to do what we're not willing to do. He leaves the choice up to us. Doesn't mean that we, can choose not to and then everything will be okay, but he does give us that free choice. But we've got to hunger. Jesus is saying those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for justice, for what is good, for what is holy, for what is right, those who hunger and thirst for God will be filled. But we first have to hunger and thirst for him. Are you, am I? Are we hungering and thirsting for God every day? Are we longing for God, or are we caught up in our own lives and business? There's a saying that I've seen before. It says, if you're not hungry for God, then you're probably full of yourself. If you're not hungry for God, then you're probably full of yourself. And I think that's a good way to put it. Are we hungering and thirsting for God and his righteousness? What are we hungry for? What are we desiring? What are we living for every day? Let's make sure that we are hungering and thirsting for God's righteousness and being filled with it through his word and his spirit. God bless.